Kunun, Stories of Faraway China by Claire Lee. It was early summer. In an old town there was a quiet lane. On one side of the lane ran an ancient canal. Green willow lined its banks. On the other side of the lane were 8 large old houses, all built in the same style. The houses were connected by a long gray wall. Only a pair of solemn stone lions guarding each of the 8 closed doors indicated that the residencies were related. Behind each door was courtyard after courtyard surrounded by rooms. In the 8th house at the end of the lane, in its second courtyard, peonies were bursting out in white, red, pink, and purple. A young couple in their late 20s were looking into the courtyard, not at the glorious blooms, but for a suitable place to bury their books and their valuables. They knew that soon there would be a war, and it would not be safe for the enemy to see those things and find out what kind of household it was. That big house belonged to my grandparents. The young husband and wife were my father and mother. My father had just returned from Nanjing, where the last group of government employees there would be evacuating Chongqing, 1,000 miles to the southwest, in the next few days. He had to go with them and had come to say goodbye. My mother, who had been staying with her parents, was in no position to travel. She was very pregnant, and the unborn child was me. 4 years earlier, right after my sister was born, my parents had gone abroad to Japan to study. My father studied law and my mother education. They had made many friends there, but the Japanese government was set to invade China. My father and my mother left their studies behind, said goodbye to their Japanese friends, and returned home. They could not believe soon that they and their friends would be enemies. My father said to my mother that she must be brave and take care of herself. They decided that the unborn child, be it a boy or a girl, would be called Kunun, which meant overcome difficulties. The name they felt would bring hope to the future. Promise me that when Kunun is born, you'll bring the children and join me in Chongqing, my father said to my mother. He promised her that he would be waiting for us. He was going to send money from my mother to his friends in different cities on the way, so she would not have financial troubles when she made the trip. My father left for Nanjing that evening. A month and a half later, I was born amid Japanese bombing. It was a difficult childbirth. I was dragged out with double forceps, and I was named Kunun. When I was only 2 months old, my mother took my sisters, a maid, and me on the long and difficult journey to join my father. First, we had to go to Shanghai, because the land route to Chongqing had already been cut off by the Japanese. After we arrived in Shanghai, we had to wait for a ship to Hong Kong. Then we had to go as far as Vietnam to re-enter China, and then on to Chongqing. As we waited for the ocean liner, my mother had no place to stay but with her cousins. My mother's cousins had taken their share of money from home and were living in Shanghai. They knew that the war was coming, but deluded themselves by playing mahjong, visiting dance halls, and smoking opium. The cousins couldn't imagine that my mother would leave her comfortable life behind and take her 2 young children to Chongqing. They knew that Shanghai would not be safe after the Japanese invaded, but to flee to southwest China was far more dangerous. I promised my husband that I would join him, my mother just said. So we boarded the ocean liner and sailed for Hong Kong. The ship was luxurious, catering to foreigners and rich Chinese. On the liner, my mother met an old family friend. Their families had been friends for generations and had both thought it would be ideal for him and my mother to get married. But my mother had insisted on marrying my father, an outsider. Her friend was now going to Hong Kong to see if he could resettle his family there. He considered that place safer than his hometown or Shanghai. He was happy to see my mother, but also astonished that my father had asked my mother to join him in Chongqing on her own. "Stay in Hong Kong and let me help you," my father's friend said to her. My mother thanked him, but "I promised to my husband" was the only thing she would say. From Hong Kong, we took another ship to Vietnam. After we arrived in Hanoi, a friend of my father's arranged for a truck to take us on the long journey to Chongqing. As soon as the truck crossed the border, the bombing started. Often the trucks had to travel on narrow, winding, poorly built mountain paths, and many were lost. Our first truck ride was a disaster. The driver was good-hearted but foolishly daring. One night it was hot, and he decided to sleep outside the truck. In the middle of the night, my mother heard wolves howling around our truck. She could do nothing but shut the windows and try to keep the rest of us quiet. The howling did not stop, and my mother heard the driver curse and then scream. The other truck drivers did not dare come down and rescue him. No one had guns in those days. Only the soldiers on the battlefront and bandits did. The next day, they found the driver's headless body dragged into a ravine nearby. Fortunately, another family offered us a ride to Kunming on the back of the truck they were riding. In Kunming, my mother met with more of my father's friends, and they offered to arrange for another truck to take us to Chongqing. By this time, my mother's financial reserves had dwindled, and she had only a few pieces of jewelry which my grandmother had sewn into our clothing. She sold most of the jewelry and paid double the fare to engage an experienced driver. It turned out to be a life-saving decision because our truck had to pass through a dangerous winding section of road where bandits were known to rob and kill refugees. One day, my mother saw a group of people on the roadside waving to stop our truck. The driver told my mother to duck, and he slowed down as if to comply. As he drove near the people, he suddenly sped up. The bandits fired from behind, but we were able to escape. Then the driver showed my mother the remains of several trucks deep down in the canyon below the cliff. No one could have survived such a fall. In the next city, my mother could not get in touch with my father's friend. There were air raids every day, and the friend had left. The journey went on. At many truck stops, my mother had to buy meager food because she didn't know whether she could reach my father's friends anymore. When our truck driver saw us eat so frugally, he offered us food. The truck transports had made the drivers rich overnight. My mother, who had never suffered hunger in her life, was too proud to accept and said she was not hungry. But the driver would feed my sister and Alan, our maid, behind my mother's back. We arrived at the River Wu in the province of Kweijo, but the bridge across the river had already been destroyed by Japanese bombing. Hundreds of vehicles carrying refugees had stopped by the river bank. They could only get across by being ferried one by one on moonless nights, when the Japanese planes could not detect them. The crossing was delayed for more than a month. Food became scarce and very expensive. My mother would eat last, and most of the time she hardly had anything to eat at all. Days dragged on. She had sold all her jewelry except for her wedding band. My father and my mother had both broken away from their intended arranged marriages and chosen each other. The wedding band had never left my mother since the day she and my father were married. My mother went to the post office every day to see if any mail had come from across the river. One of my father's friends was there, and my mother sent SOS letters asking him to send money. Then my sister got sick and needed a doctor. That day, my mother stood in line for hours, but there was still no answer. She started asking around for a pawn shop. A young female student who wanted to go to Chongqing to study was behind my mother in line. She offered to lend my mother, a complete stranger, part of her tuition money. My mother accepted the loan. She gave the student her wedding band as collateral. We finally crossed the river. Money my father had sent was waiting there. My sister got well, and my mother was able to get the wedding band back. My mother took us to a small eating place to celebrate. Suddenly, she found that she could not wipe away the tears fast enough to prevent them from falling into the soup. After weeks of hunger, soup was the only thing her stomach could hold. A month later, our truck arrived in Chongqing. A massive bombing had preceded us, and the city was almost burnt to the ground. But my father was there waiting for us. He had come to the truck stop every day to look for a young mother and 2 young children. My mother often told us children about the reunion. She said amid the chaos, she saw a thin and weary-looking young man. He couldn't recognize her either. Then he said, "You finally arrived." My father then bent down and reached for my sister. He held my sister in one arm and looked at me, the daughter he had never seen, and said, "This must be Kunan." He reached out his other hand to me, and I, a 1-year-old who had never seen my father before, let him hold me.